We like to think we're alone in our homes, safe within four walls. But what if someone else is there, watching, lurking in the shadows, living just inches away from you without your knowledge? This is the nightmare that Mark faced, a horror that would haunt him forever. The strange feeling. Mark lived alone in a small apartment on the 15th floor of a modern building. He enjoyed his solitude, preferring the quiet life where he could focus on his work as a web developer. Everything was normal until one day he began to feel like something was off. It started subtly. Objects moved from their usual places. Food disappeared from his fridge or reappeared half-eaten. Once he woke up to find the fridge door wide open, though he was certain he had closed it before bed. At first, he blamed himself. Maybe he was overworked, maybe he was forgetful. But then, things got worse. One morning, he found his phone in the bathroom, though he distinctly remembered leaving it on his bedside table. That was when the unease turned into fear. The strange noises. Late one night, while working on a project, he heard a faint rustling sound, like something shifting inside the walls. He stopped typing and listened. Silence. Then, a few minutes later, the sound returned, closer this time, like something crawling just behind the drywall. He walked toward the wall vent and leaned in to listen. That's when he heard it. Breathing. Soft, slow, human breathing. He stumbled back, his heart hammering. Could there be someone inside the air vents? How? And why? The next day he reported it to the building management, but they laughed. Maybe a big rat. We'll send maintenance to check it out. Mark wasn't convinced, but without evidence, he had no choice but to wait. Shadows in the night days passed with no strange noises, but then something even more disturbing started happening. Every morning he found his closet door open, even though he always shut it before bed. Then, one night, he woke up suddenly. The room was dark, but something felt wrong. Blinking groggily, he saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed. He froze in terror. This wasn't a trick of the light. It was a person. His breath caught in his throat as the figure stood there, unmoving. Then, in a blink, it crawled toward the air vent and disappeared inside. Mark leaped out of bed, turned on the light, and rushed to the vent. It was open. Someone was living inside, uncovering the truth. Determined to prove he wasn't losing his mind, Mark installed hidden cameras around his apartment, especially near the air vent and the closet. The first night, nothing happened. The second night, he woke up to a notification on his phone, a motion alert. He opened the live feed and nearly dropped the phone. A thin, pale figure was emerging from the air vent. Its eyes were unnaturally large, its limbs disturbingly long. It moved silently, creeping toward his bed. For a few seconds, it just stood there, watching him sleep. Then, it leaned down, inches from his face, as if smelling him. Moments later, the figure turned and walked to the kitchen, opening the fridge and eating his food in eerie silence before slipping back into the vent. Mark sat frozen in bed, his body numb with terror. He wasn't imagining things. There was someone living in his walls. The final confrontation. The next morning, he skipped work and went straight to the police. He showed them the footage, and within an hour, officers arrived at his apartment. What they found inside the vents was horrifying. There was a small nest, blankets arranged into a makeshift bed, empty food containers, and torn clothing. Someone had been living there for months. But where was he? Suddenly, a noise came from above. The officers rushed to the ceiling vent. When they pried it open, they found him, a filthy, half-starved man with wild eyes. He let out a guttural scream and tried to flee, but the police tackled him to the ground. Later, they discovered that he was a homeless man who had somehow crawled into the vents from an opening in the basement. He had been secretly living there, watching Mark every night, creeping out to eat while he slept. The aftermath. Mark never set foot in that apartment again. He moved away, but the paranoia stayed with him. Every night when he lay in bed, he found himself listening for the sound of shifting walls, for soft breathing in the darkness. And whenever he heard the faintest rustle, he wondered, was it just the wind? Or was someone watching him again? The whispering phone. Phones connect us, but what if they connected us to something far more sinister? Imagine receiving a call every night at the same time. No caller ID, no background noise, just a whisper saying your name. At first, you ignore it. But then, the whispers start telling you things they shouldn't know. And then one night, they tell you they're inside your house. This is what happened to Emma. The first call. Emma was an ordinary woman living in a small apartment in the city. She wasn't superstitious, nor did she believe in ghosts. She worked a regular job, had a small circle of friends, and spent most nights watching TV or reading. Then, one night at exactly 3:15 a.m., her phone rang. Half asleep, she reached for it. The screen was blank. No caller ID, no number. Just unknown caller. She hesitated for a second, but answered anyway. Emma. A whisper. So soft, so close, as if the speaker was right beside her. She hung up immediately, her heart pounding. It was probably a prank. Maybe one of her friends messing with her. But then it happened again. And again. Every night at exactly 3:15 a.m., her phone rang. And every time, it was the same whisper. Emma! By the fifth night, she had stopped answering. But that didn't stop the calls. The messages. A week passed, and she was exhausted. She tried blocking the number, but there was no number to block. She tried switching off her phone before bed, but the moment she turned it on in the morning, she'd see missed calls, each one at 3:15 a.m. Then, one morning, she found a new notification, one new voicemail. She hesitated before pressing play. The whisper was different this time. You look tired, Emma. She dropped the phone, a chill running down her spine. Whoever was calling her wasn't just pranking her. They were watching her. That night, she made sure to close all her blinds, double-check the locks, and keep a knife under her pillow. But at 3:15 a.m., the phone rang again. This time, she didn't answer. Instead, she texted her best friend, I think someone is stalking me. Can you come over tomorrow? A few seconds later, she got a reply. I'm already here. She stared at the message, her hands shaking. She hadn't heard anyone at the door. No footsteps, no knocks. Then, a new message appeared. Check your closet. The closet, Emma's body went cold. She turned toward the closet door. It was slightly open. Had it been like that before? She wanted to run, to grab her keys, and flee the apartment. But fear rooted her to the bed. Her phone buzzed again. I can hear you breathing. With shaking hands, she reached for the lamp and flicked it on. The room was empty. The closet, however, seemed darker. Too dark. She had to check. Slowly, she stood and tiptoed to the door. Holding her breath, she reached out and yanked it open. Nothing. Just her clothes. She let out a shaky sigh of relief. Maybe she was losing her mind. Then her phone buzzed one more time. You should have looked up. Something moved above her, the thing on the ceiling. A shadow shifted. Emma barely had time to react before something dropped from the ceiling, landing right in front of her with a soft thud. It wasn't a person. Its skin was stretched too tight, its limbs unnaturally long. The head was tilted to one side as if broken. And its mouth was too wide. It grinned at her. Emma screamed and stumbled back, falling over her bed. The creature crouched, tilting its head, watching her. Then, slowly, it reached for her phone, which had fallen to the floor. It brought the device to its mouth and whispered, Emma, running for her life. She bolted. Barefoot, heart hammering, she ran out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the street. She didn't stop running until she reached her friend's house. When her friend opened the door, Emma collapsed into her arms, sobbing. For the next few nights, she refused to be alone. She slept with all the lights on. Her phone remained turned off. She didn't go back to her apartment. Then, 3 days later, she received a call. Her friend picked up. Silence. Then, a whisper. She left. but I can wait. The apartment investigation terrified. Emma contacted the police. They agreed to investigate her apartment, expecting to find an intruder or signs of a break-in. But what they found was worse. Inside her closet, there were deep claw marks, scratches running from the ceiling to the floor. Above, in the attic space, they found a pile of old, tattered clothes, long strands of black hair, and dozens of broken cell phones. Each phone had only one contact saved: Emma. But the most disturbing thing? Her phone, still back in her apartment, had a new voicemail. The officer played it. "I miss you, Emma. You should come home." The final call. Emma moved far away, leaving everything behind. She changed her number, got a new phone, and never spoke of the incident again. But for months, there were no calls, no whispers, no messages. Until one night, her new phone buzzed at exactly 3:15 a.m. The screen showed unknown caller. Her hand shook as she picked up. A whisper. "Found you." The eye in the dark. Have you ever felt like you were being watched? Maybe you dismissed it as paranoia, just your mind playing tricks on you. But what if it wasn't? What if someone or something was watching you, lurking just beyond the darkness? This is the nightmare that haunted Daniel, a man who moved into a house with a past no one dared to speak of, a past that refused to stay buried. The house on Blackwood Lane. Daniel was a writer, the kind who thrived on isolation. He had just gone through a rough divorce and needed a fresh start. When he found an old house for rent on Blackwood Lane, he thought it was perfect. Cheap, secluded, surrounded by thick woods. The owner, an elderly man with sunken eyes, gave him a strange warning as he handed over the keys. "Don't stare too long at the darkness." Daniel laughed it off. Just another superstitious old man. That night he settled in, enjoying the eerie silence of the forest. But as he turned off the lights, something felt wrong. The darkness in the house wasn't normal. It was thick, heavy, alive. And in the pitch-black void, he saw it. An eye. A single, red-glowing eye staring at him from the far corner of his bedroom. He turned the light back on, heart pounding. The eye was gone. Maybe he was just exhausted. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. He convinced himself it was nothing. But he was wrong. The whispers in the dark. Over the next few nights, the unease grew. Daniel began feeling a strange presence in the house. Shadows seemed to move on their own. The air felt dense, pressing against his chest. And then the whispers began. They started faint, almost too quiet to notice. But as the nights passed, they became clearer. "He sees you. He knows. Turn off the light." Daniel refused. He started sleeping with the lights on. But that didn't stop the whispers. If anything, they became angry. One night, as he was writing in his study, the lamp beside him flickered. The shadows in the room shifted. And then, from behind him, a voice. Hoarse, ragged, inhuman. "Look at me." Daniel spun around, but there was nothing there. Just empty space. He barely slept that night. The night the lights went out, Daniel decided he needed answers. He asked the local shopkeeper about the house, but the man's expression darkened. "You should leave." "Why?" Daniel pressed. The man hesitated before finally whispering, "Because no one ever does." That night, the power went out. Daniel sat frozen in his chair, surrounded by darkness. He fumbled for his flashlight, but before he could turn it on, he felt it, breathing against his neck. A deep, rattling breath. His fingers trembled as he switched on the flashlight, aiming it wildly around the room. Nothing. But then, just for a second, he caught a glimpse of something. A tall, shadowy figure standing in the doorway, its single red eye glowing in the dark. It didn't move. It just watched him. Daniel ran. The tapes in the basement. He spent the night locked in his car, too afraid to go back inside. The next morning, he made a decision. He was leaving. But before he could pack, curiosity got the better of him. He had to know what was in that house. He searched the place room by room until he found a trapdoor in the kitchen, leading to a basement. Inside, the air was damp, and the walls were covered in deep scratch marks. In the far corner, there was an old wooden box. Inside it, a collection of videotapes. Daniel dusted off an old TV and played one. The footage was grainy, but he could make out a man, frantic, terrified. He looked straight into the camera, eyes wide with fear. If you're watching this, it's too late. You've already seen him. Daniel's blood ran cold. The man in the tape continued, voice trembling. He's in the dark. He watches. He waits. And once you see his eye, he never lets you go. The screen flickered. For a brief moment, Daniel saw the man scream before something dragged him into the darkness. The tape ended. Behind him, the lights flickered, and in the reflection of the TV screen, a single red eye stared back. The escape. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed his car keys and ran for the door. But as he reached for the knob, the house shifted. The walls seemed to close in. The shadows pulsed. And then he heard it. The voice from the darkness. You can't leave, Daniel. The door wouldn't budge. The windows wouldn't break. It was as if the house itself had come alive. And then the lights went out completely. Daniel fumbled for his flashlight, turned it on, and nearly screamed. The figure stood inches away from him. Its skin was like burnt flesh, stretched over long, bony limbs. Its grin was impossibly wide, filled with jagged teeth. And in the center of its face, that single, glowing eye. It reached for him. The final hours. Daniel did the only thing he could. He closed his eyes. The whispers filled the room. Look at me. Look. Look. He squeezed his eyes shut, refusing, and then silence. The air became lighter. The pressure disappeared. When he opened his eyes, he was standing outside the house, the morning sun blinding him. He didn't question it. He ran to his car and never looked back. The aftermath. Daniel moved to a new city, started a new life. But the nightmares stayed. Every night, he dreamed of that red eye. And then, weeks later, his phone rang at exactly 3 a.m. He answered, his breath shaky. Silence. And then, I see you, Daniel. The breathing walls. Have you ever been alone in a room and felt like the walls were closing in on you? Maybe it was just your imagination. Or maybe something inside the walls was watching you. This is the nightmare that haunted Oliver when he moved into an old house with walls that seemed alive. At first, it was just a feeling. Then, the breathing started, and by the time he realized what was hiding behind the walls, it was too late. The house on Willow Street. Oliver had always wanted to live alone. No roommates, no distractions, just peace and quiet. When he found an old Victorian house on Willow Street for rent at an unbelievably low price, he jumped at the chance. The landlord was eager to get rid of it, barely answering Oliver's questions. It's been empty for a while, and the man said. Just don't do any renovations. It was a strange request, but Oliver didn't care. The house was beautiful, with its high ceilings, intricate wooden floors, and massive walls that made every room feel isolated, too isolated. The first night. The first night was uneventful. Oliver unpacked, made dinner, and went to bed early. But then, in the silence of the night, he heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound. Inhale, exhale, like someone breathing. He sat up, heart pounding. He checked the windows, locked. The door, secure. There was no one else in the house. And yet, the sound continued. Inhale, exhale. It wasn't coming from the vents. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the walls. The moving shadows. Oliver tried to ignore it, convincing himself it was an old house settling. But the sounds didn't stop. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. At night, when the lights were off, he swore he could see shadows moving along the walls just out of the corner of his eye. Once, as he reached for a book in his study, he felt it. The wall moved beneath his touch, like it wasn't solid, like something underneath it had shifted. One evening, as he was brushing his teeth, he noticed something in the mirror. The bathroom wall behind him pulsed, as if it were breathing. That was when he decided to investigate. Chucker, the hole in the wall. Oliver couldn't shake the feeling that something was inside the walls. So, ignoring the landlord's warning, he grabbed a knife and cut into the drywall. As the plaster crumbled away, a rotten stench filled the room. And then he saw it. A hole. A small, dark hole, leading into the space between the walls. Heart hammering, he grabbed a flashlight and peered inside. At first, he saw only wooden beams and dust. But then, something moved. A glimpse of rotting flesh. A wet, glistening eye staring back at him. Oliver stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The breathing sound grew louder, more frantic. And then, a hand shot out of the hole. The whispering walls. Oliver ran, slamming the door behind him. He barely slept that night, but when the sun rose, he forced himself to check the wall again. The hole was gone. The drywall was perfectly intact, as if he had never cut it open. But now the house had changed. The walls whispered, "Let me out. Please help us. Don't let him hear you." The voices were desperate, trapped. And then our new voice. Deep, guttural, inhuman. You shouldn't have looked. Oliver grabbed his keys. He had to leave. But as he reached for the front door, it wasn't there. The house is alive. Where the door had been, there was now just a wall. Solid, cold. His windows? Gone. The house had sealed itself shut. Panic surged through him. He pounded on the walls, screamed for help. But outside, the world was silent. Then, the breathing returned. But this time, it wasn't just inside the walls. It was behind him. Slowly, he turned. A tall, twisted figure stood in the hallway. Its skin was stretched tight, its face half melted as straight into the wall. It was in the wall. It opened its mouth, an endless black void, and screamed. The final hours? Oliver ran, he didn't know where. Every hallway twisted into another. The house was changing, reshaping itself like a living organism. Every door led to another room, no exits, and the walls. They were closing in. He heard the whispers again, now frantic. Run. Hide. He's coming. Then, silence. A shadow loomed over him. Oliver turned, heart pounding. The last thing he saw was the walls opening up, a gaping, fleshy maw, and then the darkness swallowed him whole. The house still stands. Days later, the landlord came by. He knocked, but there was no answer. The house was silent. Still. Another tenant gone. With a sigh, the landlord put up a new "for rent" sign. Because the house was hungry, and it was waiting for the next one. The dark web, an uncharted abyss of the internet where anonymity thrives, and the shadows conceal both secrets and nightmares. It's a place spoken of in hushed whispers, a lawless underworld where anything can be bought for the right price. Some venture in out of sheer curiosity, unaware that curiosity itself can be a dangerous game. Mark was one of those people. He wasn't a hacker nor a criminal, just another thrill-seeker fascinated by the unknown. But what he didn't know was that once you step into the darkness might just follow you home. Mark had always been intrigued by the dark web. Stories of secret forums, hidden services, and untraceable transactions fascinated him. Late one night, armed with a VPN and a special browser, he finally took the plunge. At first, it was exactly what he expected. Black markets offering stolen data, counterfeit money, and drugs. But then, he stumbled upon something far more intriguing. A forum that claimed to fulfill any request. No questions asked. Curious, Mark decided to test its legitimacy. He composed a simple message. I need something to scare someone. A harmless prank, nothing more. Minutes later, a reply appeared. Consider it done. He chuckled. That was easy. Too easy. By morning, Mark had nearly forgotten about the request. Until an email arrived. The subject line read, Check your front door. His heart pounded as he opened the door. Sitting on his doormat was a small, rusted music box. He hesitated, then turned the key. A slow, eerie lullaby filled the air. Mark laughed nervously. That's it? He had expected something more dramatic. But later that night, as he lay in bed, that same chilling melody echoed from outside his window. The next day, another package arrived. This time, it wasn't a simple music box. It was an unmarked VHS tape. Mark didn't own a VCR, but curiosity got the best of him. He found an old player at a thrift store and inserted the tape. Static. Then, grainy black and white footage. His apartment building. Filmed from across the street. The footage zoomed in on his bedroom window, on him sleeping. Then a distorted voice crackled through the speakers. You asked for a scare. Consider this the beginning. Mark panicked. He shut down his computer, deleted his browsing history, and tried tracing the email. It led nowhere. The sender had covered their tracks perfectly. That night, another email arrived. Running won't help. Watch the next tape. Mark refused. But when he returned home later that evening, he found another package, this time inside his apartment. Fear settled deep in Mark's chest. He checked the locks. Everything was secure. How had someone entered? Just past midnight, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Look behind you. Mark froze. His hands trembled as he turned, only to find nothing. But on the wall, written in smudged red ink, was a single word. Smile. Desperate, Mark called the police, but without evidence of a break-in, they dismissed his fears. Determined to uncover the truth, he checked his apartment's security camera footage. The timestamp read 3 a.m. A hooded figure stood outside, motionless, staring at his window. Then, as if sensing the camera, the figure looked up, directly at him. Mark was done playing games. He returned to the dark web forum and sent a desperate message. Who are you? What do you want? An immediate response appeared. One last request. Accept it, and we disappear. Decline, and we come inside. Mark hesitated. Against his better judgment, he responded, Fine. What's the request? The reply made his blood run cold. Invite us in. He slammed his laptop shut. His breath came in short gasps. This isn't real. It can't be real. His phone buzzed. A new message. Too late. A slow, deliberate knock echoed through his apartment. Mark didn't move. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Then, silence. He exhaled in relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe it was just a sick joke. But then, from the hallway, he heard it. The creak of his bedroom door opening. By morning, the neighbors reported hearing screams from Mark's apartment. When the police arrived, they found the door ajar, the rooms ransacked. But Mark was nowhere to be found. On his desk, his laptop screen was still on, displaying the last message he had received, request completed. To this day, Mark remains missing. No trace of him was ever found. But some say, if you log on to the same dark web forum and type his name, you might just get a response.